Welcome to the latest episode of the Street's Stocks and Markets podcast, where, you guessed it, we talk all about things that shape and impact the stock market and investing. I'm Chris Versace, portfolio manager of the Street's Pro Portfolio, and if you've been paying attention to some of the headlines making the waves over the last few days, you know that we've seen a dramatic increase in geopolitical tensions. Lucky for you, lucky for me, that on this episode of the podcast, we have Peter Tchir to help break it down. Peter, for those of you who don't know him, is the head of macro strategy at Academy Securities, but he's also a Street Pro contributor and a friend of the podcast. Peter, welcome back.
Thanks a lot for having me again.
So I'm just going to open it up with a quick comment, Peter. Trying times the last few days. What do you think?
Yeah, so we've been looking at that, and it's, Academy Securities is kind of unique. We have about 30 retired generals and admirals, a couple CIA people who provide the geopolitical intelligence, and so we kind of get to, take a lot of that into account. And I would say things are actually going quite well. I think one of our views has been that we need to reestablish both deterrence or, peace through strength. And I think one of the things we all have to realize is deterrence really only works if your adversaries are scared that you will use the equipment that you have. And I think over the last, probably decade or longer, we've done a couple things. One, we talk about measured response. So everything that happens, we tend to have a very measured response, which is maybe why the Houthis are comfortable attacking ships that are destined for the U.S. or, U.S. flag, but will not touch a Chinese ship. So I think that's been an issue. And we've also had, kind of a tendency to draw lines in the sand. Those lines in the sand get crossed, and we kind of shrug our shoulders and move on. So if we want to really establish,
So it's kind of like that old Bugs Bunny cartoon?
Exactly. So I think this is I think whether we destroyed, Iran's nuclear facilities or not, I certainly think we damaged them. That's much as clear. But this is really a warning, I think, that, hey, we have these tools, we have this capability, and we will use them if necessary. So I think this was a one-time strike. It's meant to push Iran, but I think it's also meant to signal to China, to Russia, that, hey, we are not afraid to do what we need to do to protect our interests.
Now, that's interesting because you're connecting some dots outside of, the Middle East, as you mentioned, China and Russia. But you also said you think it's a one-time strike. So when you see words out of President Trump of, where if Iraq were to retaliate, and by now we know that they have, you're thinking this is more bluster, or is he just kind of saying, if you guys really push it, not save face with a modest attack, but if you really push it, I will go further?
Yeah, so I think it's much more the latter, where they have to do something much more aggressive. I think the attack that they've done so far has been very telegraphed. When you pull this back, right, Israel dominates the airspace right now. We obviously took advantage of the Israeli-dominated airspace to go in. Not a single shot was fired at us. Very impressive. But beyond that, I think we look at a couple things what's going on right now, why we think Iran will be very limited in their ability to attack. Unclear how many missiles they have, but the missiles, they've done damage, and it's horrible, and loss of life is obviously horrible. But the missiles have not been this existential threat that I think some people were worried about. So the damage being done by the missiles themselves has been, limited and contained to a large degree, certainly much better than we feared.
More importantly, and it was only 6 missiles last report.
Yeah, and I'm even talking about the attacks on Israel going back, right?
Oh, so, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yep. So none of this attack has been very effective by any real standard. Separately, the missile launching capability is becoming in question. So estimates are maybe they had 80 to 100 launchers. That could be as few as 20, because every time they launch, it sends a signal. You can get the heat reading, and Israel is trying to take them out. I think they've been very effective. So their ability to launch a lot of missiles, even if they have missile stockpiled, is deteriorating. And the Iranian military, unlike ours, is really top heavy. So it's very hierarchical. Only the leaders can make certain commands. So as Israel, through the Mossad and other things, has eliminated a lot of the IRGC senior leadership, it's unclear who the leaders are, what control they can do, what message, and even how motivated they are, right? If Khomeini's in hiding, how much are you going to go out of your way and put your life at risk if your leader's in hiding? So I think there's a lot of reasons to believe Iran will back down. I think I'm actually a little bit more worried, is that enough for Israel? Or does Israel really want to push this forward, knowing that the proxies, are kind of non-existent right now, that they have, a once in a lifetime potentially opportunity to really, really set Iran back. And the other thing I don't think that gets talked about anywhere near enough is, let's call it the tacit approval of the rest of the Middle East. Right? Our view has been that the Middle East is desperate to move beyond conflict and fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia wants to become the data center capital of the world, right? They are excited.
Mm-hmm.
Just Jensen Wang came over. They're going to buy NVIDIA chips. They want to move us on. And I don't know whether they're outright helping Israel, but they certainly aren't on Iran's side. So there's so many things I think that we can look to that point to Iran's backed itself into a corner and no real way out. And again, to tie one last piece in, I think our view is that China is probably telling them, hey, it's not in our interest for you to shut down the Straits of Hormuz. It's probably not in
Right.
your interest to do that. So all these things tell me that this is near the end rather than early innings of kind of some sort of negotiated peace.
So you would think that, as we're taping this early in the week, airing on Wednesday, week's time, maybe less, there is some, more progress on a diplomatic solution.
I think so. I think it's now whether they offer enough on the nuclear side to get Israel and or the president comfortable, that remains to be seen. But I think there will be some, some sort of outreach, some sort of attempt to, cease the hostilities, back everyone off, figure out what can be done, things calm down. And to be honest, that's when I think we're a little bit more hopeful of a potential regime change. And I want to be very careful when I talk about regime change, because we do not think that it's in the anything should be started by either Israel or the US.
Hmm.
Anything where we kind of accelerate or create a regime change, I think much more is the hope that you get, a groundswell in Iran where the 90 million people kind of get sick of how they're living compared to how much of the rest of the Middle East is living, right? The areas around them are far less repressive than they once were. You can go to Saudi Arabia and see things now, women driving, things that were unheard of even 10 years ago. So I think you're hoping for some sort of Arab Spring, some groundswell coming up from the people. And that's where it would be helpful if so many of the IRGC leadership is gone. Is there the real willingness to crack down on the people, or could this gain momentum? So that when I look at regime change in our geopolitical intelligence group, I think that's what we're looking for, is something like that rather than something started by the US or Israel.
Okay. And earlier you mentioned there's concern that you have that Israel might keep going, to use your words. How do you game that out? Because I'm sitting here thinking that there are other parties around the world that up till now they have been kind of on Israel's side, but if they go too far, I just get the impression that we're going to see other countries kind of step in and kind of rein them in.
I think that makes sense, right? They will continue to attack the air defenses, make sure that Iran remains vulnerable. They won't let them rebuild. I'm sure if you see activity around any of the nuclear sites that indicate either movement or rebuilding or efforts to fix things, those will be attacked as well. But I think all that, if it contain like that, that lets us move on to that peace stage. And I believe you're 100% right that at some point, President might say, "Hey, we did this, we did these things. It's now your turn to back down," right? We are playing, carrot and stick, and it's now your turn not to use the stick.
Right. So just to be clear, when we hear Israel say that they have a, continued list of targets, you think it's just more towards winding down what they've already started.
Yes, I think it's to finish off and make sure that they are not susceptible from attack, that they do derail the nuclear program. But again, that I think can then lead to negotiated settlement of some sort.
Okay. So, maybe in a week's time, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, we have yet another geopolitical item that we have to be paying attention to, this settlement, this peace negotiation. But at the same time, Peter, we're juggling how many trade conversations as the US? So how do we kind of trust that all things will be dealt with as they should, whether it's trade with China, trade with the EU, given the July 9th date, this obviously, and other things. How are you seeing all this come together?
I think just like you, our weekend note was actually titled "Lots of Moving Parts" with all capitalized lots, because there are so many things to look at. I think on trade, we're kind of boiled down that we expect pauses and extensions to kind of be the norm. I think one thing about this administration is they're way better staffed up front than Trump 1.0 was, but not every deputy undersecretary has been in place. It's unclear whether all the staffs are in place. Marco Rubio is effectively doing two full-time jobs right now. So I think this administration, it's very Trump centric, and he has his handful of people who do a lot of this. So I think that's a limiting factor, right? How many things can you do
Hmm.
if your main people who work on one thing are in the ready room getting ready for this attack? Other people are, you just don't have that. So when I'm looking at trade, I think the market's right to extensions are the likelihood. Maybe we get one or two sort of UK style announcements that are okay. I think he's kind of backing away from trade. I see Canada. I think he hated and we'll go back to one step. So
Hmm.
our belief has always been Trump likes to do things personally, right? He likes to walk into a room, shake someone's hand, and come out with quote unquote a deal. And we can agree whether or disagree whether the deals are good or not. That's
Right.
how he likes to do it. He hated Trudeau. I don't think he hates Carney, so that's been an improvement. One of the things we're seeing too, the Canada-U.S. tariffs and Mexico as well are much less impactful than we would have thought. Because one of the things is the USMCA compliance is allowing companies that had not get, you can actually go through a process to get your products labeled USMCA compliant. A lot had not bothered to do that because it was expensive and there was no added benefit from that. Now with the tariffs, you're actually seeing a lot of companies go through that, get the approvals. So the effective tariff rate's actually quite manageable, I think, right now. Energy was 10%. So you're seeing that move away. I think Europe, unfortunately, is going to bear the brunt of any remaining kind of anger. And part of that's because it doesn't suit Trump's style, right? There's no one to go into Europe and say, okay, what's the deal, right?
Right.
Individual countries barely have the say, and the head of the EU, who knows what they're like? Are they even a figure? So I feel the EU is probably where we might get some risk, but I think this moves on. We kick the can down the road. We get these extensions. I think markets can live with that. I'm a little bit afraid that Trump might be, encouraged by how well the stock market has done and decide let's give tariffs another go. I don't
Ugh.
think that happens. I think he's turned. I think he's moved away. The other thing, I think he's listening to a lot more people. I think he's starting to listen to. If you look at migration issues, he's clearly listening now to farmers. He's listening to the hotel and leisure business, and seems to be backing off a little bit there and making concessions that would allow those migrants to stay. And I think, and I keep hearing that he's hearing a lot more from small and mid-sized businesses through chambers of commerce and direct connections, and through a lot of the state representatives or local representatives that, hey, you are hurting your base, right? Small and mid-sized business people loved
Hmm.
you. You are not helping them right now. So I think he's moving away, and hopefully we can move on to national production for national security, other things that are far less tense and zero sum games.
So the one country you didn't mention in that was China. And my thinking just on all of the tariff front, just to share it with you, Peter, is that we're gearing up for the June quarter earnings season. Right, it's right around the corner. Companies will be resetting guidance for the second half of the year, and to the extent that we have these unresolved issues or extensions, right, there's going to be a lot more uncertainty about what the final terms will be. I suspect that we'll see companies guide probably more cautious than not, something similar that we saw in the March quarter earnings season, and we'll see consensus EPS numbers for the S&P 500 in the back half of the year come down. But I also think that it's past a certain point, Trump needs to get some wins on the board. So, and I think once you get that first domino to fall, call it China, call it the EU, call it the UK, it becomes easier for the others to kind of fall on top as well. Do you
Yeah.
think? What, so, what do you think to that?
So one, I think I completely agree that he needs some more wins. And I think if Iran plays out like we think, that will actually be a win. Obviously, it's not trade related, but I think that momentum carries into other things, right? It's all of a sudden people may look at the president as, oh, now you've won. Now you've done something aggressive. You've done something different than we expected. And I think that could translate into trade deals. I think it would be helpful. I agree with you that I think companies are going to be a little bit conservative. I think we are going to see one question I've wondered is, are we seeing sales of US brands globally diminish with this? Is there an anti-US brand backlash that might start showing up in some of these earning calls? So I think that's where we'll see it. I think the one thing that's offset a lot of the potential risk is every company I think we talk to, AI spending remains high. And I think the
Mm-hmm.
reality of that is if you think the economy is going great, you want AI to be efficient. If you think the economy is going poor, you want AI to be efficient
That's
because
right.
that will
That's
help you
right.
through. But my view is we're going to start seeing weaker job numbers in particular. I think the data has already been a little bit overstated and not all the data has been particularly good. And I think that will coincide with what you're saying, kind of bringing down Q3 and Q4 numbers, a little bit of weak job front, and we're going to put the Fed on board, and Trump probably has to be cautious about pushing anything too far.
So I'm glad you brought up job numbers because there's a number of different sources out there, whether it's the employment report, ADP, Challenger job cuts, and all these others. And there was an interesting line in the May employment report that kind of alluded to the fact that government workers that were taking the packages that were offered by Doge, that they were still working until the end of September. So I am a little concerned that come the October timeframe, we're going to see a rollover in those public sector jobs, which we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen that. There's a couple things I look at too. The birth death models attributed a lot of jobs the past 2 months. I think it's 600,000 jobs out of the past 2 months, so more than the total jobs. And why that concerns me is, and this gets a bit wonky, but bear with me for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So you apply for an EIN, an employment identification number, if you're starting your own business. And that traditionally, I think, really worked well as a good indicator. Like if you apply for that, maybe you're setting up a bakery, so you'll have 3 or 4 employees. So I think they try and judge that. I think what happens now is as you see your job deteriorate, you're like, well, maybe I'll do some Uber Eats, maybe I'll do some Lyft, or I'll do, something along those lines, and you go ahead and apply for an EIN. There's all sorts of companies that help you try and set that up. It's a good way to track that money separate from other things. So I think EIN is much more a sign of weakness. Who was really starting jobs, their own businesses in April, May? It did not seem like an ideal time to like, hey, you know what? I'm going to start my own business. It felt like an ideal time to ooh, maybe I should do some Uber or Lyft to supplement my income.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. It seems more like the gig economy taking over.
Yeah, and the other thing I point to, and you might think it's insane, but I think it's actually fairly rational, is law school applications are off the charts high. And to me, if you're a senior or a junior and your job prospects aren't looking great, you apply to law school because hey, there's another 3 years to do something quote unquote productive.
I have let's just say that given when I graduated college, I knew more than a few people who did that very thing. Same thing with grad school too.
Right. And so I think all those things to me are indicating that the official data, and you look at ADP, which in theory, ADP should have better data than the US government, right? The US government relies on these surveys where we get 30% response rates, which is abysmal, right? If you ask 20 people for an answer and like six of them gave you like, are you really going to base your whole number on that? Aren't you going to try and figure out
Right,
why the heck
right.
are the other 14 not sending a response? So I think ADP has been very weak. I think all those things are going to tell us that they've been overstating jobs for the past 2 months and things are weaker than we thought. And that's when the tariff impact will start kind of like, ooh, there is something going on behind the scenes.
Well, I think we saw that too in the flash June PMI report from S&P Global. It's one of the data sets that I track rather carefully, and it's kind of interesting. On the one hand, it showed a pickup in employment. It showed, the both the manufacturing economy and the service economy doing okay. Manufacturing improving compared to May. To me, it seems to raise some questions about potential restocking from the pull forward ahead of tariffs. But the thing that really jumps out at me was the inflation data, where clearly, compared to April, compared to May, the inflationary pressures accelerated. And I was just kind of sitting back, chuckling to myself, because last week we had Fed Chair Powell who said, we got to wait, see more good data. Someone's got to pay for these tariffs, let it flow through the system, and it seems like Powell was correct.
Yeah, my view on tariffs has been that let's say it settles in at this 10% sort of level, which given that I expect another pause, I feel the exporters will eat some of it, not, call it 3, 5%, something like that until they can
Mhm.
push through their, plus a lot of the exporters already agree to, pricing. Then the importers will gradually try and pass some of this through, but it'll probably take time, right? They have some long-term contracts, so it's not like you can up it all at once. And then I think the other thing we all forget is if something sells for $100, the purchase price might be $40. The tariff's on the $40. So it's $4, not $10 of tariffs that have to get eaten.
Right.
So I think ultimately it'll get passed on to the consumer. So I think we're going to see a steady kind of 1 to 3% kind of upward pressure on inflation coming from tariffs. But I don't think it's going to be this one-time spike. You're going to see it bits in here. I saw someone else who pointed out, canned vegetables or canned food went up on the last CPI report. Not vegetables or fruit themselves, but the canned vegetables and fruits. And that's because the price of the cans have been
Yeah.
going up. So it's
Yeah.
going to hit in all sorts of weird little ways. I think it's going to be more of a steady kind of grind that's going to be offset by the jobs. But I
So
think it's going to start showing up. And the other thing I think none of us who try and track any of the data can really tell you is you had this huge pull forward in goods purchased to get ahead of
Hmm.
the tariffs.
Hmm.
Then you had this slowdown while everyone waited. Then you had another huge response while the tariffs were paused. It's really difficult to try and figure out what's the steady state of the economy right now.
So does that argue for the Fed to sit back until maybe September when they have a policy meeting, collect data over the next 3 months, and say, okay, yeah, inflation is picking up, maybe the employment numbers are softening, where we can contemplate doing something, or maybe something completely different unfolds?
I think if we get the extension, it's another 90 days. I think the Fed could at least think about a July cut and certainly put the next meeting on the table. Because really the big uncertainty was when we were throwing out those, Liberation Day tariffs, everything was, it was just insane, right? And,
Yeah.
90% here, 35% there. And I do think that at this kind of 10%, it's just a little bit more manageable. So I think they could put it back, but that's probably partly because I think the job numbers are going to be weak enough to justify that. So I think on the balancing, inflation's still going to be not coming down to where they'd like it, but I think jobs are going to start decelerating at a point where like, okay, we better do something here.
So let me ask you this: on the jobs front, do we need to see 1 or 2 months of job losses for them to act, or do you think that we can still see minute job creation and they can still deliver maybe one cut?
I we probably need 1 month of job losses or very small jobs with yet massive revision so that the net number looks bad.
Right.
I'm also, to me, the unemployment rate's tricky because I believe that stayed at 4.2%. But that's again, this all gets wonky, and I'm learning on the fly all these things, of course. But the household survey is what they use to calculate that. So household survey showed 600,000 jobs lost. So that should have moved the unemployment rate up by 0.2%. But 0.2% dropped out of the labor force, so that's why it stayed at 4.2%. But to me, 0.2% dropping out of the labor force, maybe it's migrant workers, maybe it's something that tells me again, things aren't great when people kind of are dropping out of the labor force.
Right. Totally agree. Totally agree. Well, we will see. We've got, I think 3 months of data before we get to the next Fed policy meeting. Depending on the data, I think that we could very well see the September SEP go from 2 cuts to 1 cut. But again, we got a lot of data between now and then.
Right. And that it's so hard to tell where this stuff's going to come through, how it's going to come through, and what the reaction of the Fed. And I will say, I think if Trump was less aggressive with Powell, he'd be more likely to put cuts on the table sooner. I feel it's backfiring. I feel this pushing someone into the corner has been backfiring.
um, you know, uh, I think Powell's largely a straight shooter, but I would agree. I think there are times he gets his back up a little bit, understandably so. I mean, he's out to do a job that he knows what his mandates are. He knows what he has to do. I just think that,
And it's an incredibly difficult job to
oh
do
yeah.
at the best of times, let alone when data's all over the place, when economic policy. And again, like, we haven't even touched on all of this has still been just really by executive order. So the big beautiful bill would be actually nice to get something passed that's official that we can all point to and like, ooh, we will have this for a long period of time, as opposed to executive orders, which some of them are being challenged. That to me would be the beauty of getting this big beautiful bill through is okay, we now have a baseline that we can work with.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because before we get out of here, I'm going to ask you this last question, Peter. Do we see the bill get passed, the big, beautiful bill get passed by July 4th?
I doubt by July 4th because I think there's going to have to be a little bit more corralling and cajoling to be done, and that's probably hard to be done. Again, I think Trump moved things along. He talked to the right people, the right groups, and pushed this through. I would say the more he wins on Israel and things like that, the more likely it is that this moves through. If we start seeing breakdowns, I think there were a number of Republicans who don't feel he's necessarily lived up to what they were looking for. Some even from the MAGA side, and then beyond that. I think initially there was this huge fear amongst everyone that you would get primaried out by Musk if you kind of did anything against the president's
Mhm.
wishes. Some of that may be dissipating. So I think we can push this through. I think it's crucial that we get something done that's reasonable. I could see this breaking a little bit apart. So that's why I'm so excited by what I think is going to turn out to be a big win with Iran, that it just pushes everyone over the hurdle and let's get this done and move on, even if we don't make quite the July 4th deadline.
Well, that could set up a good second half of the year.
And I think that would be the exciting part, right? And to me, I'll come back to this national production for national security, right? how this wasn't a wake-up call 5 years ago, I don't know. But whether it's chips, but you look at the last two negotiations with China, rare earths and critical minerals are at the heart of it. And I keep trying to get this, in my messaging. Sometimes it's hard. I really don't care that much about the raw commodities, the rare earths and critical minerals. They're available everywhere. We will be able to buy some from places. It's the processing. China controls 90% of the processing and refining of these rare earths and critical minerals. That's what we need to be doing domestically. And the one thing I've been a little bit disappointed with in Academy Securities, we were talking about national production for national security. That tended to include our allies, working with Canada, working with Europe, where people could use their strengths to kind of bring this to the table. We've moved away from that. Maybe we kind of start pivoting back to working with our allies. We're not there yet, but there's hope certainly that over this next 6 months. But that's what we have to do. We got to address that. That Trump, to me, a lot of that's deregulation. That's pushing things through. That's the stuff Trump loves. He's good at. If he can do that, I think that still takes away jobs from China. It takes away jobs from elsewhere in the world, but it's not as upfront and in your face as a tariff policy.
That it doesn't make for as good of a headline, right, as in battling China for rare earths when you've got to talk about building your own, as you say, domestic refining and production capacity.
But hopefully that's where we can see this shift. And Besson, I think, really started some of that back at the Milken Institute when he talked about the three-legged stool. Like that to me was, I think, what our hope was with Trump. He kind of caught us off guards on how far he went with Liberation Day tariffs and stuff. Now that he's back down from that, he's talking to other people. That to me would be the direction. And that could be really good for the economy. And I like owning things that will benefit from those types of things, the processing and refining of rare earths and critical minerals.
Picks and shovels, so to speak.
Exactly.
Excellent. Peter, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the podcast. As always, insightful, informative. And folks, if you're not reading Peter's stuff at TheStreet Pro, you really, really should. I encourage you to do so. And that, my friends, is this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back with a fresh one before you know it.